flourish, and I think it would be a wonderful thing to happen here. My presentation, as has been suggested, is about dress. And I want to argue that clothing and dress are not frivolous, frothy topics, subjects that are diverting, fun to research, but essentially lead us away from what's really important about old age, the serious issues of frailty and difficulty. Rather, I want to argue that clothing and dress offer us new insights into central debates about the constitution of age and ageing. Debates about the interplay between bodily and cultural ageing. How much of what we understand is physiological, and how much is actually social and cultural? And what's the complex interplay between those two elements? The status of age as an identity, the degree to which we're perceived, ordered, judged by our position within an age hierarchy, and the ways this does and doesn't give us meaning, shape in our lives. The role of material culture in supporting or undercutting those meanings, allowing us to perform or possibly to resist those age structures. Also, the reconstitution of ageing thesis, the idea that the nature of later years is somehow changing under a series of cultural and demographic pressures, and particularly also the role of consumption in those ideas that things are changing. It also opens up debates about the emergence of the third age with its distinctive kind of imagery, and the way that's often linked to debates about a specific cultural cohort, in particular the baby boomers. Baby boomers fascinate the media. They've become one of the most dominant discursive constructions of older people within the media. Yet, as I'll suggest later, it's actually a highly sectional, fairly problematic sort of account, and I think diverts us in many ways. But clearly, questions of dress are very often implicated in these debates about the baby boomers. Also questions about the moral regulation of age, distinctive ways older bodies are policed and disciplined. In particular, the way differential judgments are made about scruffiness or stained clothes or torn hems, or all these sorts of elements that in younger people are fun and no problem, as it were, but once they become exhibited by older people are dangerous signs of failing to meet the moral regulation required. Dangerous signs that might take you out of the mainstream and put you into the category of pitiable old age. Now that's an old story, it's not a new story, but I think there's a new twist to that that's come with the new modes of governmentality, new disciplinary practices in relation to age being requirements. That we exercise governmentality over our bodies, that we get involved in anti-aging practices, that we make the best of ourselves. And of course, this is clearly linked to the wider bodily perfectionism that we see in the wider culture, and we're particularly familiar with in relation to pressures on younger women. But I think the suggestions, ways of these pressures are also now extended to middle age and older women too. So we've got new disciplinary practices. So I want to suggest that looking at dress allows us to reposition and refresh our analysis. It brings a new lens to capture the everyday lives of older people. After all, dress is a mundane, everyday practice. It's something we all do, everyone. It's not confined to the fashionable or clothing-oriented or the interested. Everyone gets up and gets dressed, makes choices in the market. So it's about the everyday, quotidian, ordinary ways in which we present and order and manage our bodies. And in a way that links to something that I've always been interested in, or been interested in for a very long time. In the past I've done work on bathing and dressing and frailty and issues of that sort. That's similarly concerned really with about the everyday and the mundane and the way in which we mark out our lives through practices of this sort. So I see this work as a continuation of that. Looking at dress also enables us to add a material analysis to our thinking in gerontology. Looking at the ways clothes are made, sold, worn, adapted, disposed of, the way they pass through our lives. Items of dress are often very eloquent testimonies to embodied values, embodied memories, and they're a way, therefore, they're part of a methodology we can use in order to get people to reflect on and think about their lives both now but also in the past. Many people, particularly many women, will be able to remember that dress I wore when, as it were, able to recount the nature of their lives through dress. And in my main book I have a section in which we have dress stories in which women talk about precisely their relations to dress through their long lives. So enabling us to set the analysis of later years, old age, in the long context of the whole life, rather than sectioning it off as a special category. And looking in this sort of way also, I think, enables us to escape from what can often seem rather a narrow preoccupation with the interests and concerns of government and policy makers. Now, those are very important. Work in that tradition is extremely important. I've done work in that too. But I think there's more to be said about old age than problematic old age. And I think new work that is coming through enables us to explore the experiences, the subjectivities of older people themselves and put those much more to the fore. And I think that's something to be welcomed. Now, all of this can be encompassed really within what we would see as part of the wider cultural turn. Cultural turn occurred across the social sciences in the late 20th century, particularly in sociology and cultural studies, areas of that sort. And it's relatively late in coming to social gerontology, but it has begun to make really quite a considerable impact, creating the new field of cultural gerontology that sets later years and experiences in this wider and social and cultural context. And in particular, it's seen the coming into gerontology of work in the arts and humanities. Because one of the things that's been so refreshing about the cultural turn is that it's not confined to social science, but it's began to bring in work from literary scholars, people doing work on the arts, people doing poetry, historians, all these sorts of joined in and begun to look at old age, a subject that was traditionally just not looked at in those fields. If you're interested in this wider cultural turn, Wendy Martin and I have done a Routledge handbook, which we're publishing at BSGNI in Newcastle, launching there in Newcastle in July, and that's a flyer, as it were. If you want flyers, I'm sorry, I left them in the hotel, I've put up my address there, so send me an email and I will send you a flyer and you'll get a reduction as a result. So, let's return to our topic of clothing and dress. Clothes lie on the boundary between the body and its social presentation. As such, I think they're key to how the body is presented and enacted socially. So clothes reflect ideas and norms about later years and its cultural estimation. Because dress is one of the means whereby social difference, we're used to social difference as a social category, it's one of the means where social difference is made manifest and visible to us. Now, we're very familiar with this in relation to gender or class. Indeed, gender differentiation in dress is one of the most common patterns cross-culturally that we observe, in which we can see people, who they are in terms of gender by relation to their dress. And similarly, class has been very significant within the analysis of clothing and dress within sociology. Class, since the days of Veblen and Zimmel, has been a central form of analysis. But I want to argue that that's true also of age, and we need to bring age into those categories of social differentiation. So it's part also of the enterprise of putting age into those gender, class, race categories that we're so familiar for. Because dress practices encode and reflect age as a social category. So they help to constitute age, like gender, like class, as a social category that is visible. And one of the clearest ways we can see this is in terms of what I call age ordering in dress. And this is the long-established cultural pattern whereby we can see age ordering. Age ordering, systematic patterns, systematic of cultural expectations according to an ordered and hierarchically, that's an important word there, hierarchically arranged concept of age. So it's a persistent normative pattern. Of course there are historical specificities, but there is a kind of persistence around the kind of things that are seen to be part of age ordering and dress. And this is a set of norms or values that are largely expressed negatively. So it's not so much of what older people ought to wear as what they ought not to wear. That's the crucial thing here. So we've really defined in terms of a series of avoidances, things you've got to avoid. So dress in relation to age is more covered up, with longer skirts, with longer sleeves, with a looser cut, duller, darker colours, sober, more self-effacing, less style-conscious styles, and avoiding any claim to sexual attention. So that's essentially what age-ordered dress is, thought to be appropriate. And we can illustrate this historically, and I'm going to show you what a really remarkable manuscript that was prepared in the 16th century in Augsburg in Germany. And it was prepared under the commission of a merchant, a man called Matthias Schwartz. And Matthias commissioned an account of his life in terms of pictures through the medium of dress. So he has commissioned to have depicted his whole life wearing different outfits through his life. So it's 88 images, 86 different outfits, going from the period of his birth to the age of about 60. So let's have a look at these so you can see. So here's Matthias at the age of 14, age of 26, 23, 27, 38, 41, 53, 56, 63. And you can see the pattern of age ordering. You can see the coming of black and grey. I'll just go through this again because they're rather fun. There he is, young, there's older, a young man, flute playing, different styles, still some red stockings there, but onto grey, onto black. Okay, we can also see this age patterning in the very familiar pyramid of age that people will be no doubt familiar with. And this is an example from America from the 1840s, Life and Age of Woman. As you can see, it depicts the life of a woman as she goes through the different ages. It's 7 in this case, isn't it? Yes. And as you can see, the clothes change are emblematic of the different stages of her life. So we have the frilly dress showing her ankles with the low neck and the short sleeves, probably a lighter colour, and then slowly more matronly gown, but still sort of with a low neck, and then slowly more and more closed in, more and more dark. But of course, it's not just that the clothes change during that pyramid, but the body that wears those clothes changes markedly. And we can see how that there's an interaction between these two. And that points us really to an important truth about clothing and age. And this is about the interplay between bodily and cultural aging. Aging is a product of both physiology, bodily change, and cultural social expectations. Clothing and dress are cultural, how we enact and present age, but clothes are also material objects that interact with the bodies that wear them to some degree, give them shape and meaning. Because the body alters systematically as we get older. And I'm going to illustrate this here from a shot from the design studio of Edinburgh William Mills, which is a company that specialises in older people. And what you're seeing here are the fit models, and on this side is the old fit model, the traditional fit model that they used to use. And you can see that's been slightly adjusted for age with the lower bust line, as it were. But this is the new fit model, which was developed as a result of a major study, national study on the physiology of the shape of the whole nation, not just older people. And one of the products of that was that they produced a new mature body fit model, and this you can see is the mature size 18. And you can see it's systematically more age adjusted than this. So this has got the lower bust, but it's got a very flat stomach and all sorts of aspects that you might think are not terribly realistic, but one on the other side shows it. So as a result, designers, when designing for the older market, learned to adjust the cut of their clothes to respond to bodily changes and the cultural estimation of these. Now, some of the things they do relate to actually physical changes, like a thicker waist, shoulders come forward, bust lower, those sorts of things to make the fit more effective. But some of the things are about cultural estimations and interpretations of those changes. So the longer skirt, the more covered up sleeves, the higher neck, are responses to what is seen or culturally esteemed about the signs of aging. They're about hiding the aging, in which aging is seen as a form of dereliction or objection, something that needs to be hidden. And that links really, I think, to a wider sense of that many women report of becoming invisible. Now we need to set this in a larger political context. Barnard has argued that dress is ideological. It's part of the process whereby groups establish, sustain and reproduce relations of dominance and subordination. And it's part of how those relations are made to appear natural, proper and legitimate. Now most of this work again has been in relation to gender and in relation to class. But in fact I suggest it also applies to age. And reflected in those dress codes that I talked about, the drab, dull, self-effacing, don't look at me kind of clothes, that are, as it were, a political message containing about status and value. But isn't this all changing? You know, all very well, but surely things have changed. The dominant account is certainly suggests that this culture of greyness and self-effacement has gone. Older people are not having to do this any longer, says the account. Older people are now surely part of the mainstream. And I think this little cartoon by Posey Simmons gives you some of the ambivalences about this kind of argument. So you see it's called A Lifetime in Baby Wear, 7 Ages of Man, so it's back to that pyramid that we know. And we can see that, well, he's wearing the same clothes, but actually he's not actually wearing quite the same clothes, because as we look, Posey Simmons very skillfully has put in the differences. And you'll notice the elastic waists that's there at the beginning and there at the end. Elastic waists are diagnostic of clothes for older people, I can tell you. And so it's that interplay between the body and the clothes, because of course the bodies, as you can see, change markedly as well. Now, in my study, I did have some evidence for change. I did in my study looked at the testimonies of older women, clothing company retailers and journalists, and this is the flyer for the cover for the book. And at this point I'm just going to make a very slight aside to address the question of men. My study looked at women, and there's a whole number of reasons why clothing and dress is a feminised field. But in many ways, some of the same pressures apply to men, in a different way, refracted through different cultural assumptions. But men too get up every morning, make choices about what they're going to wear and go to dress. And in fact, I'm about to embark on some future work looking at older men that Lieberhuhn have given me money for. But let's go back to the main study. And I did have evidence of cultural change from the main study. And I'm going to read you a classic example from the design director of George at Asda. When I first started working 30 years ago, there was a point of time when people, the majority of people, would switch into that way of dressing, into classic dressing. I should tell you, classic dressing is code for older. Because they felt that was appropriate to their age. That's gone. A huge change, and it's a huge change in my lifetime. I'm going to skip a little bit forward, I'm conscious of time. But I think we need to be slightly cautious, because there clearly was evidence also of continuity of norms, those things I talked about being more covered up. Many older women reported having faced what we can call the changing room moment, when they looked in the mirror and they see that styles that once were nice are no longer. When you're in the changing room, you see, oh goodness, is that me? And I just think, no, I can't wear it anymore. It's a lovely style, I just can't wear it. I just feel very sad. And then I've got to look for something that's more appropriate for my age. I was also going to set this, and I'm going to jump over this, I'm sorry about this, in changes that have occurred within the economy, and particularly within the fashion system. Because one of the things that's happened is we've seen the enormous spread of fast, cheap fashion to the whole population. And this has produced in many ways a true democratisation of fashion in the 20th century, in that really pretty well everyone can engage at some financial level or not. And it's also created a very energetic search for new markets by the clothing industry. And the two groups that they've been particularly targeted on, one is children, enormously successful, the spread of fashion to children in the last 10 years, and the other has been attempted to do the same in relation to older people, and I think they have. And this is just a little chart, we won't go into it quickly, but what it tells us is that older women are now shopping as often for clothes. Women over 75 are now shopping as often for clothes as women in the 16 to 34 age group, the most frequent always shoppers, were in the 1960s. So there's been an enormous speeding up of the fashion cycle. And this, of course, relates also to questions like the reconstitution aging thesis, the idea that later years have reconstituted as an extended plateau, and that we've got a role of consumption in the creation of a third age. But is there a problem about talking about these kind of third age things in terms of gerontology? In particular, is it a sectional analysis? And I'm going to show you some pictures that sort of mediatized accounts that focus on a narrow section of the well-off. They come from a New York website called Advanced Style, and you can see it's very New York. You can see it's a kind of performance of age, and this was also a television program that picked up on these themes of performance and change. Now, I think the danger really is that if we buy into this celebrationist imagery based on consumption, we can be diverted by the dreams and fantasies, which are the basis of consumption imagery. And there's a danger, I think, of academic analysis becoming complicit in that consumption-mediated imagery. So I think we need to be careful in looking at subjects like fashion and age, not to be drawn into that celebrationist discourse, seduced by media accounts with its biases. And I think we can point to parallels with some of the post-feminist celebrations of empowerment with exaggerated forms of femininity in a similar way. And also, often this connects very much with the baby boomer analysis, that language of baby boomers that permeates the media account and is in many ways, I think, really quite problematic. Because it is a very sectional analysis. When we think of a baby boomer, we don't think of a 68-year-old miner with emphysema living in South Wales. But technically he belongs to that same category. So without necessarily realising, we've imported a great deal of class assumptions, income. It's a particular subsection of older people that are described in these terms. It's a heavily classed account. It's also, I should say, a heavily coupled account. It's all part of the fantasy of middle class coupledom. But again, we need to remember that the majority of women over 65 live uncoupled. So, it's a kind of fantasy rather than a description. I'm going to jump over resistance. I'm sorry about this, but you'll see some tempting pictures. The essence of this is to say that resistance is a very interesting, politically difficult sort of issue. There are different sort of ways we can see it. But the essence, I suppose, the point I want to draw most strongly about resistance is that older people are as diverse, indeed more diverse than younger groups. And I think when you look at responses to areas like clothing and dress, you really have to remember that. There is enormous diversity of response. We wouldn't expect women in their 40s all to have the same attitudes, same ways of dressing, same ways of thinking. But why should we expect then of women in their 70s? So I think it's a really important that we need to keep this diversity of view, even if we're at the same time wanting to look at and analyse aspects in relation to age. Now, in this last section, I want to shift our focus slightly and take us to a very different social location, that of a long-term care facility and to situations of people with dementia. I did a study on dementia and dress with Christina Views. And partly that was about challenging the assumptions that this kind of analysis in terms of dress really only relates to younger elders. You know, it fits terribly well with this kind of 50 to 70, still sort of busy, still sort of shopping, etc., etc. But we wanted to show, and I think do show in the study very clearly, that questions of dress are still significant, even for people living with quite severe dementia. So dress remains relevant to their lives, men and women, because this looked at men as well, and in particular through its role in supporting embodied personhood. And we had a number of conclusions and thoughts. One is that dress in this context represents the environment closest in. It's literally the thing that's next to you. So as your life maybe closes in with dementia and becomes much more narrow, so the things under your hand, to your hand, are more important. Clothing can be a source of benign person-centred interactions, particularly between care staff and older people. Not always, but particularly so. And certainly in relation to relatives. Clothing and dress matters enormously to relatives. They want to see the person they love in the kind of clothes they're familiar, that express and embody their personality, supporting habitual embodied character and behaviour in many ways. Continuity of identity, enabling enactments of parts. But clothes are not not just part of the current interactional order in the care home. It was interesting, women were still exchanging compliments. Even women with dementia would still say, oh, that's a nice jumper, or something like that. Habitual ways of relating for women. So it supported that kind of behaviour. But not just that interaction order. Clothes could also be part of remembering and being located in the past. They were sometimes used by residents to remind themselves and those around them of the person they were who had been. And that could occur even when the garments themselves had long gone. They could still be part of a process of travelling back mentally to a better place than the person was now. And I'm going to give you a quote, final quote, that illustrates this. And it concerns a gold lame jacket. Rita was living in a care home and had quite severe dementia. And she often used to talk about her clothes now and in the past. And in particular, she used to talk about a gold lame jacket. I used to have a lame jacket and all, and it used to sort of light up when I was in the room. They'd all stare, because it sort of shone, you know how it does, lame. I liked it. I liked that lame. It glittered, it stood out. Do you get me? It sort of shone like it's true. And I think that quotation shows us the way dress still has a capacity to reach across even to situations of dementia and enable people to imagine themselves and be a kind of person that they were and the kind of person that they feel they still want at some level to be, even in the context of quite severe dementia. So, let me just finish. So let me return really to that initial argument I made about clothing being not a frothy, frivolous kind of topic. And a response really to the charge that cultural approaches, generally subjects like dress, take us away from what's serious in relation to age. And in particular, the idea that they may threaten us with an apolitical analysis, one that sort of neglects the politics of age. And I hope really I've given you some of the senses in why I think this is a mistake. Because some of the deepest assaults of ageism actually occur at the level of culture, in assumptions, in comments, in norms, in values of that sort. And unless we're able to tackle and look at those, then we're not really going to be able to look properly at the politics of age. So I think these kind of approaches can in fact deepen our analysis of old age and in ways that enable us to address directly the structures of ageism. Thank you.